I opened the envelope the way I always did, with a butter knife slipped under the glued flap. Expecting nothing more than the usual groceries, gas, maybe a dinner or two on our joint credit card, but the line item stopped me cold. L'Armoire Boutique, downtown, 3 separate charges across 2 weeks. Each for amounts that made no sense in our budget. And the name alone made my stomach tighten because it wasn't a place for men's suits or electronics or even gifts you could pretend were household items. No. It was racks of tailored dresses and silk tops displayed behind spotless glass walls on Market Street, a place I had passed on my way to work, never once stepping inside because I knew we couldn't afford it. Yet here it was on the statement, $428, $316, $599. And I sat at the kitchen table with the late sun slanting across the wood, hands going clammy, trying to make the numbers mean something else, maybe a mistaken swipe, maybe fraud. But my mind was already spinning into the one explanation that fit too neatly. The one I didn't want to say aloud. That Mateo had been buying women's clothes for someone who wasn't me. Because he had never once surprised me with anything from downtown, not for birthdays, not for anniversaries. He was practical to a fault, giving me books I requested, a mixer when I started baking, never couture, never clothes. And the more I stared at the charges, the more a heat rose in my chest. A mixture of nausea and rage, until the sound of his key in the lock jolted me upright. And I shoved the bill under a stack of unopened mail, though my heart was pounding so hard it felt visible through my blouse. He came in smelling faintly of motor oil and the stale air of the garage where he worked, dropped his backpack near the door, kissed my cheek distractedly, asked what was for dinner, and I almost blurted it out right then. Demanded to know whose dresses he was paying for, but the words caught in my throat, heavy as stones, and instead I ladled stew into bowls with hands that shook, watching him eat, listening to the scrape of his spoon, every tiny motion exaggerated in my mind. And all the while that boutique name screamed silently from beneath the pile of envelopes, daring me to pull it back out, daring me to say something before it consumed me whole. That night I barely slept, the air in our small bedroom thick with the sound of his steady breathing, as if he carried no secrets at all. While I stared at the ceiling tracing cracks in the plaster like road maps leading nowhere. My mind circling back to those receipts, L'Armoire Boutique, over and over until the name lost meaning but the dread stayed sharp. I reached for my phone in the dark, tempted to Google the boutique's hours, tempted to call the credit card company right then, but I stopped. Because if it wasn't what I thought, if there was an explanation, I would be the one who had crossed a line. And yet every memory of him lately flickered with suspicion. The overtime shifts that stretched later, the texts he ignored until hours passed. The way he sometimes came home with a faint scent that wasn't gasoline or grease. Something floral, faint but enough to make me feel like an intruder in my own house. I remembered last Saturday when he said he had to cover a late repair. But he came back freshly showered, hair damp, shirt clean. And I told myself not to overthink it. But now the boutique charges twisted that memory into something jagged. By morning my hands shook pouring coffee, and when he asked why I was so quiet I said nothing. Just smiled thinly. He kissed my forehead and left for work. And as soon as his truck rattled down the street I pulled the bill from under the mail. Stared at the dates, circled them with a pen like a detective, 2 Thursdays and a Tuesday. Days he was supposed to be working late, and something in me snapped into decision. I dressed quickly, drove downtown, parked 3 blocks away because I didn't want him or anyone he knew to see my car near that boutique. The glass windows shone. Mannequins draped in cream blouses and skirts that whispered money. I stepped inside and felt the chill of air conditioning wrap around me. The saleswoman in sleek black looked me up and down with professional politeness. Asked if I needed help, and I forced my voice steady as I asked whether anyone named Mateo had made purchases there recently. She tilted her head, brows pinching. Said she couldn't share customer information, but something flickered in her expression. A recognition, and before she smoothed it away I knew the truth had already seeped through. That he had been here, that he had handed over our card, that she had rung up the sales. And I stood frozen among the racks, surrounded by silk and linen. The ground shifting under my feet as if the life I thought I lived was only a costume I'd been loaned without knowing. I left the boutique without buying a thing. The heavy perfume of the store clinging to my hair like an accusation. And I sat in my car gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles whitened. Staring at the meter ticking down the minutes. Wondering how long he'd been walking through those glass doors while I folded laundry. While I believed his stories about double shifts, the traffic on the interstate, the extra jobs he claimed to take so we could get ahead. And the betrayal felt so physical I pressed a hand to my chest as if I could steady the pounding inside. I drove aimlessly through downtown, past the courthouse, the diner with the chipped red booths, the bookstore where we used to linger when we were dating. Every corner seemed to mock me with echoes of the life I thought was ours. Until I finally pulled into a quiet side street and scrolled through my phone, searching for anything, maybe a hint on his social media, though he barely posted. Maybe messages hidden, but his phone was always locked with a passcode he claimed was for privacy at work, and I had trusted that, foolishly, until now. I remembered the boutique clerk's eyes, that flicker of recognition she tried to swallow back. And I felt a cold resolve settling in. I couldn't keep circling questions in my head. I needed proof, something undeniable, so I called in sick to work the next day. Told my manager my throat was raw. And when morning came I parked near the garage where Mateo worked. Sipping burnt coffee from a gas station cup, watching the bay doors roll open. Mechanics in coveralls moving in and out, but hours passed and I didn't see him. His truck was gone from the lot though he had kissed me goodbye claiming a busy schedule. My phone buzzed with a text from him around noon. Crazy day, won't be home till late. Don't wait up, and that was when my vision blurred, anger and clarity mixing. Because I could see the pattern now, I could almost map it, the boutique charges. The late nights, the clean shirts, someone else's perfume, and I thought about following. About hiring someone to follow, but instead I drove home and tore open the junk drawer where we kept old receipts and warranties. Pawed through until I found the shoebox he sometimes shoved papers into, and there, folded inside an oil change receipt, was a thin slip from L'Armoire Boutique. Dated last Tuesday, my name nowhere on it, a silk-wrapped dress described in neat type. And holding that paper in my hands was like holding a confession written without words. Something I could not ignore or unsee. And my whole body went still as I realized the confrontation was no longer optional. It was coming, and it would break something we couldn't tape back together. I hid the receipt inside a cookbook on the shelf, sliding it between recipes I never tried. Because I wasn't ready to lay it bare on the table just yet. I needed to see his face when the truth cracked open, not give him time to build excuses. So I rehearsed lines in my head while stirring pasta, while folding towels. phrases that sounded sharp enough to slice through denial. But when he finally came home that evening, shoulders loose, humming under his breath, setting his keys down with the same careless clink as always, the words caught in my throat. And instead I asked if he wanted a beer, pretending at normalcy even as the weight of that boutique slip pressed against my ribs. He showered, ate, told me about a customer's busted carburetor in detail, hands gesturing like nothing was amiss, and all the while I nodded. But I watched him too closely, every twitch of his mouth, the way his eyes avoided mine a second too long, the silence between sentences that seemed stuffed with lies, and later, when he was asleep, I lay awake again, the ceiling a blank witness, and made a decision: if I couldn't push the words past my lips, maybe I could catch the truth with my eyes. So 2 nights later, when he said he had to stay late again, I followed, keeping a block behind his pickup, my palms damp on the wheel, heart skittering each time the brake lights flared. He didn't turn toward the garage, not even close. Instead he wound through downtown until the boutiques and bistros glittered in neon. And there it was, L'Armoire, lit up like a stage, his truck pulling to the curb. And I watched him step out freshly pressed, not in the stained coveralls he claimed to still be wearing, but a button-down I hadn't seen before, crisp against his shoulders. And my throat tightened so hard I could barely breathe as a woman emerged from the boutique door, dark hair gleaming under the streetlight, wearing a pale dress that fluttered in the evening breeze, and the way he bent toward her, handed her back, the easy intimacy of it, told me more than any receipt ever could. I ducked lower in my seat, pulse roaring in my ears, as they disappeared together into the night, leaving me trembling behind the wheel, gripping it as if it could anchor me, knowing my world had tilted off its axis, and there was no way to pretend anymore. I sat in the car long after they vanished, the city sounds blurring into a low hum while my thoughts fractured, half of me wanting to storm after them and rip open whatever secret they thought they could keep, the other half frozen by the sick weight of seeing it with my own eyes. The proof undeniable, I couldn't move until the parking meter blinked red and a passing couple glanced at me curiously, then I drove home in a fog, headlights slicing through the dark as my hands gripped the wheel hard enough to ache. When I pulled into our driveway, the porch light still glowed, welcoming, mocking. The same house where we'd painted the walls together, where his boots had lined up neatly by the door. And stepping inside, I felt like an intruder in a stranger's life. I poured myself wine I barely tasted, sat at the kitchen table staring at the clock, every minute dragging like a punishment. He came home past midnight, shirt slightly wrinkled, hair mussed as though from someone's hands, and when he saw me awake he blinked in surprise, mumbled something about a long shift. I wanted to scream, to hurl the wineglass at him, but instead I asked flatly, "How was work?" And he spun another story with that same even tone, the lies sliding too easily. And I nodded as if I believed him, letting silence spread between us until he went to bed, unaware that my body was taut with the knowledge of her dress, her hair, his touch, the image branded behind my eyes. The next morning I moved on instinct, quiet, deliberate. I dug deeper, through pockets of his jackets, under the seat of his truck, inside the garage tool chest, and what I found were more fragments. Perfume-scented tissue paper, a ribbon knotted from the boutique, a receipt tucked hastily into a manual, each one a thread pulling the fabric of us apart. And as I held those objects I felt the shift inside me, something hardening, a resolve forming that I wouldn't just wait for his confessions. I would make him face what he'd done, but not with shouting, not yet. I wanted him cornered with no escape. Wanted him to realize that the life he thought he'd split in two had already collapsed. And that I was no longer the oblivious wife folding his laundry in the dark. I was watching. I knew, and I was ready. The following days blurred into a performance I never imagined myself capable of. Smiling at breakfast, asking about his schedule. Pretending to believe the same tired excuses while inside I catalogued every gesture. Every slip of his voice, waiting for the moment to strike. I kept the boutique receipt tucked in my wallet like a blade. Touching it sometimes just to remind myself this wasn't paranoia, this was real. And one evening when he mentioned another, late repair, I told him casually I might stop by the garage with sandwiches. His eyes flickered then, just a fraction. Before he covered it with a shrug, said they might be too busy to talk. And my chest tightened with the certainty of it. So instead of going home that night I parked again a street over from downtown. My breath shallow, waiting, and sure enough his truck appeared. Headlights bouncing as he pulled up in front of that boutique, but this time he wasn't alone. She stepped out from the passenger seat, laughing at something he said. Her hand brushing his arm like it had done 100 times. And I realized he wasn't even hiding carefully anymore. That I had become the background of his double life, invisible, replaceable. The rage inside me burned so hot I thought I might step out right there. Scream his name across the pavement, but instead I stayed in the shadow of my car. Recording with my phone, capturing the two of them crossing the street hand in hand toward a restaurant lit warm with candles. And it was almost unbearable to watch him hold the door open for her the way he used to for me. The ache so sharp I pressed my fist to my mouth, but I kept the camera steady. Because if he wanted to pretend nothing was wrong I would show him the truth he couldn't deny. I would line up the receipts, the recordings, the lies. And force him to see that the woman he thought was still sleeping blind beside him had already woken, and she was done waiting quietly in the dark. The night I chose to end the silence I set the table with precision, 2 plates. Silverware aligned, the kind of ordinary meal we used to share without thought. But my chest buzzed with something electric, the evidence gathered. The phone hidden in my pocket, the boutique receipt pressed flat beneath his plate. He came in whistling low, the way he always did when he thought life was steady. And for a moment the sound nearly broke me because it was so familiar, so normal. But then he sat down, lifted his fork, and saw the slip of paper staring up at him. His hand froze, eyes darting up to mine, and I didn't flinch, didn't blink, just asked. Steady as I could, "Who is she?" The silence stretched, heavier than any shout. Until he exhaled like air had been punched from him, muttered something about a customer. A mistake, but before the lie could fully form I slid my phone across the table, pressed play. The glow showing him and that woman stepping from his truck, his hand on her back. Their laughter spilling into the night, and his face drained of color. Mouth opening then closing, no script left to recite. "I followed you," I whispered. The words trembling but sharp, "I know everything." And in that instant the house felt too small to contain the wreckage between us. He stammered apologies, half-formed excuses, but I cut through them. Telling him I was done being the blind background character in his story. Done carrying the weight of his double life. He reached for me across the table but I pulled back, the chair legs scraping against tile. The sound like a final snap, and I left him sitting there with the untouched meal, the receipt, The recording still glowing between us, because there was nothing left to salvage, not trust, not love, not the years we had layered together. Only the echo of what we'd been and the bitter clarity of who he had chosen to become. And stepping outside into the night air, I felt the strange quiet of freedom settle around me. Heavy and light at once, the knowledge that betrayal had broken the life I knew. But it had also unshackled me from pretending it still existed.